Okay, so hello to everybody. Welcome to the sixth session of the 2021-2022 Learning Exchange Series. I'm your host today, Kylie Clay. I'm the Associate Director of the Forest, Carbon, and Climate Program at Michigan State. We're pleased to lead the Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group, which is a diverse group of forest interests with over 60 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than a decade to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and the prevention of land use change. You're seeing now the full year's lineup of speakers. It's a bit small to read, but we'll go ahead and drop the link in the webpage to the webpage that you can check out all the speakers in a little bit more detail. This year we have three major thematic bins: voluntary carbon markets, changing landscapes of climate and forests, and then emerging science. So on our open resource library, you can watch recordings for any webinars that have already taken place that you're seeing here, as well as from previous years. For today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Rachel Pasternak, Ethan Belair, and Yang Wang from the Nature Conservancy. They'll give a presentation today called Emerging Climate-Oriented Bioeconomy Frameworks, a Central Role for Forests. They'll be presenting on a very exciting multi-part project they've been working on, assessing from a host of different dimensions the realities and potential impacts of mass timber. So today's session is the third presentation falling under that climate and forests in a changing landscape. So we're very excited to begin today, of course, but before we do, I'd like to share just a few brief details. First, to automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our mailing list. Next, the session is being recorded and will be posted on the web alongside previous recordings. So it will be posted alongside supplemental resources such as the presentation slides in the next week or so. And if you've registered for this event, you'll receive an email letting you know when and where to find those materials. So this session will be followed by a Q&A, time permitting. On the bottom of the Zoom interface, you'll see both chat and Q&A. Within each, either or, you can ask questions at any point throughout the presentations. If you're calling in on the phone but have access to email, you can email forestc@msu.edu. We'll be compiling all the questions over here and pose them to our speakers at the end during the Q&A session, again, time permitting. So a couple of other things here. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF, and this will be automatically communicated to SAF provided you've received credit, provided you've registered with your information from your SAF account. If you have questions about this, just reach out to us. Again, forestc@msu.edu. And with that, TNC team, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to just kick us off and give a short intro. So I'm Rachel Pasternak. I work at the Nature Conservancy in our Global Natural Climate Solutions team. Today, we're going to talk to you about emerging climate-oriented bioeconomy frameworks and the role that forests play. So really excited to be here today and looking forward to the Q&A session at the end. Ethan, next slide. Great, thanks. So just a quick disclaimer and request. The project that we're talking about today specifically has 5 phases. Phases 1 through 3 have been published in a special issue of Sustainability. We can send through the link to that and you can see the papers that are correlated with that special issue. Phase 4 that we're going to really be focusing on today is ongoing, and we have some preliminary results. And we're still kind of actively designing this research, but we're really keen to get your input and your thoughts on that, and looking forward again to the discussion. So please don't share any of the details that we might go over about phase 4 today, especially without checking with us first. Thanks. So who we are, TNC, I'm sure as many of you know, is a global science-based environmental organization. We have global reach and scale. We work across 50 states and 70 countries and house more than 600 scientists. Our priorities are to protect the health of the world's land, oceans, and freshwater, and also address the urgent climate crisis. Next slide. And sorry, I just on the other side of that other side, I should say, is just our team that's here today, specifically talking to you, including Young, Ethan, myself, and our other colleague, Caitlin Clark, who I believe is also dialing in. And this project specifically is an ongoing collaboration with 20+ organizations. Sorry about that, next slide, thanks. So as I mentioned, one of TNC's priorities is to address the urgent climate crisis. Within that, we have several pillars of work. So the natural climate solution science, low carbon economy, how we try to accelerate natural climate solutions and implement them globally, and also a resilience and adaptation pillar. On the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about natural climate solutions in case you aren't aware. NCS is how we, it's science that came out in 2017 by TNC, and it highlights how we can use nature as a tool for mitigating a changing climate, and how it provides the bridge of about 30% of the emissions reduction we need between now and 2030 to stay below levels of kind of catastrophic climate crises. So part of our team today, Ethan focused on the science of that, and Young and I focus on how we try to sustainably accelerate what the science tells us on the ground. So what are the policy mechanisms, the enabling conditions that we need, the finance, the markets, but also the safeguards that we need to make sure that we're able to accelerate NCS globally, but do so in a way that's sustainable and responsible. Thanks. So one of the things that's come out of the research around natural climate solution is that there are various markets that can help us accelerate NCS. And one of those kind of emerging potential quote unquote demand tools is mass timber, that is building with wood. I think most of you know what mass timber is. It's a suite of wood products that are essentially glued together and become as strong as cement and steel. So you can build high rises with them, for example. So on the right, you kind of see, what it looks like to stack particle boards together to get CLT. On the bottom, you see what you get. On the bottom right, you can kind of see what you get as a whole building. So this is Albina Yard, a 4-story office building in Portland, Oregon. So why is this important? Well, we know that a large part of our our carbon emissions come from the building sector. Concrete and steel play a huge part of that. And the way in which we mitigate that is currently, there's still a lot of potential options. Also the amount of building space that we need globally is continuing to grow, right? It's looking at probably doubling over the next 40 years. So we need to, there are alternatives that we need to find in terms of how we, mitigate a climate crisis with a housing crisis globally. And so there are many folks looking into whether mass timber can play a role as part of that solution, and how building with wood might change that. So we see that demand for mass timber is rising globally, but we need to know what that means for forests. And so that's kind of TNC's central question. As we start to find these solutions, and nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, what is the impact on the environment? What is the impact on potential impact on forests that might have, both positive and negative? Sorry, Ethan, if you just do a few clicks. Yes, thank you. So we look at it, the mass timber as a forest product from a range of potential climate mitigation solutions. So The mass timber as a product provides a sequestration benefit. That is, the trees that are grown in the forest are sequestering carbon. The forest product that you make out of those is then also storing the product. And then if you're building with mass timber versus concrete and steel, you also get a substitution benefit from using a more climate-friendly product. So next slide. I think that might be it for me, Ethan. Pass it over to you.
It is, and I'm going to unmute. So thank you, Rachel. And I'm going to walk through now one of the projects that we've been working on for the last 2 or 3 years, trying to assess what the overall impact is from that increased demand and continued increase in demand for mass timber. What sort of impact that has on the forests that we have in North America. So to sort of zoom out and look at the motivation for why we designed this project and why we had the different phases that we do, I think it's worth introducing sort of the lens that we're using to look at this. So there's a couple of different logic chains that we've come across again and again in our own thinking and in the thinking of collaborators and external partners. So one of these is what I would say is sort of the environmentalist viewpoint, right? And that, to try and way overgeneralize is that we have harvesting to cut some trees. If we see an increase in mass timber, well, that takes wood. And so, of course, we're going to see, a big spike in timber harvesting. It's going to be a lot of deforestation. It's going to be a really bad thing, right? Again, vast overgeneralization, but that's sort of the logic chain that we've seen in some places. We look at that, we say, you know what, seems overly harsh, seems overly generalized, and we really need to investigate all of the assumptions that are baked in there to see whether or not that holds water. On the other side of the coin, a viewpoint that I sort of call the rose-colored glasses view, right, is that, hey, mass timber is a sustainable product made out of small or low value trees, or it can be. Therefore, if we're only harvesting small and low value trees to make mass timber, we're actually providing a market that doesn't currently exist. We're increasing the ability of foresters and loggers to improve forest health and address issues in forestry through harvesting. And that because of that, we're going to get healthier forests. Well, we call it the rose-colored glasses edition because that's, a little bit overly optimistic. There's a lot of assumptions in there about the use of small and low-value trees, which may or may not be true. So we wanted to, again, dig into that and see whether or not this holds water. So basically, we see that there are some theoretical benefits to substituting mass timber for steel and concrete. Obviously, when you're using something that regenerates on a much shorter timeline than do some of the inputs into steel and concrete, there's going to be a benefit there, right? We want to know, very keenly, what are the actual benefits that we realize from that, though, right? Because we can think about the benefits in a sort of idealized scenario, but it's really when you hit the ground with markets and competing land uses and competing products that some of the truth comes out of this story. And lastly, we wanted to see if, in this 5-phase project I'm going to describe, there's sort of a meta benefit of having people from the building trades and global wood products industry and conservation fields all together for this conversation, so that we can really, as best as we can, optimize the use of mass timber to where it is most beneficial. So yes, looking at cross logistics and NCS. So we've mentioned this 5-phase project a couple of times. I'm going to walk through each of the first 4 steps in some detail so that you can understand kind of where we're coming from. And again, as Rachel mentioned, phase 1 through 3 have recently been published in a special edition of Sustainability, and phase 4 is ongoing Yang and I are in the depths of modeling right now. So phase one, this was, a whole building life cycle analysis. So life cycle analysis basically being from cradle to grave, what is the environmental impact of a given action? So in this scenario, we're looking at different building types, both, residential commercial buildings, different sizes of those buildings, and buildings that are made primarily with mass timber versus traditional concrete and steel construction. So we worked with some folks you can see in the bottom right hand corner, a lot of different partners that helped us work through this LCA. We used buildings in 3 different regions across the United States, and we looked across the entire lifespan of that building, and then after the basically assumed demolition of that building at an 80-year lifespan. So the results that we got out of there to try and take a 6-month process and put it into a nutshell is that the benefits of using mass timber are not linear with building size. It's not as simple as saying the more mass timber you use, the more there is a benefit. It really has to do with the details of building codes and construction techniques that are required for different types of buildings. So the substitution rates there vary depending on the stresses and structural features of individual buildings. There's also variation by region. Primarily, that variation has to do with the types of trees that are used to make mass timber. So if you're, building something in Atlanta, Georgia, the mass timber is going to be primarily using southern yellow pine, right? And that has a certain wood density to it, and it holds a certain amount of carbon. That is going to be different than if you're working in Seattle and you're using primarily Douglas fir and western hemlock. So there's variation between regions. And then, unsurprisingly, the benefit increases the longer that the mass timber building stays upright and continues to hold on to that carbon. So this figure shows that basically the overall carbon storage benefit of mass timber versus a concrete and steel construction, the tipping point is about 22 years in this particular scenario. Again, this varies across region and building type, but so for this type of building, 22 years you sort of break even in terms of the carbon benefit, and the longer you keep the building thereafter, it's accruing additional carbon benefit because you're not having to provide additional indoor space with concrete and steel. So those results from the first phase, the life cycle analysis, then got sort of recycled or pulled into phase 2, which was a regional demand assessment. It was based on a bunch of underlying variables like the housing starts and the economic situation in different locales, based on the performance and cost comparison of mass timber versus concrete and steel, and based on some really interesting social dynamics that I'll talk about in a minute. What would we expect in terms of the adoption of mass timber in different regions? And this time we zoomed out and went global. So we were comparing, South American regions with China, with the US, with mainland Europe, and looking at adoption rates based on all of those factors. So here we basically wanted to be able to predict, what demand there might be for specific types of mass timber and specific uses of mass timber in those different regions of the globe. So again, a few general results here. These are adoption rates in terms of the mass timber required to build the buildings in the US across about the next 40 years. And what's important to see here, I think, is that there's variation in the adoption across different types of buildings, right? In the right-hand side, there's very few buildings that we predict in the larger size classes of buildings, the 13 stories and higher, but it becomes quite a popular option in this model for the lower, primarily non-residential buildings. So this is for the United States. What I'm going to look at now is the exact same model run, but this is for China. And what you'll notice here is that all of the adoption curves that we're showing have a less of a steep incline, right? It's a shallower incline. And in fact, in some of these scenarios, we have very little adoption at all. And I should mention that the top, middle, and lower tiers of these graphs show basically what adoption scenario we're using. On the top is the conservative example of people sticking with what they know. On the bottom is our optimistic scenario where we assumed that people were, strongly moving toward mass timber. And I'm going to flash back and forth between the US on the first slide and China on the second side. And I think that this is interesting to think about because, when we think about this, or at least when I think about this, I think about the carbon in trees, the longevity of the products, those sort of nuts and bolts things that we can quantify in a biological sense. And what the difference in these two graphs is showing us is the social difference in terms of adoption of new technology, at least in the building trades, for the United States versus China. And it shows us that based on the assumptions that we have here that are built based on past data, there's a little more hesitancy in the Chinese market to adopt new building techniques and to risk the cost of learning a new technique when it's unproven. So I think that just points out for me how complicated a topic this is, and the fact that we need to take into account a lot of different factors in how we consider mass timber. Okay, so to try and sum all of that up, again, the big takeaway here was, everything varies, right? It's varying according to those different social dynamics. It's varying due to economic drivers like housing starts and available capital. So there's a lot of variation, so we can't make broad sweeping statements about the benefit or the harm of mass timber. It's region specific. Another thing to mention here is that the expected demand of mass timber in all of the scenarios that we modeled. So we had, low, medium, and high adoption. We had different regions across the globe. We had different building types. Across all of those, the expected increase in demand was in the low millions of cubic meters of wood. So what does that mean? In an absolute sense, think about it, it's millions of cubic meters of wood. That's a lot of trees, right? So this is an important thing to understand and to get the right answer on. But when you think about that number, a few million cubic meters in the context of the global trade for wood products, it's actually a relatively small percent, right? So that percentage is single digits in most cases, and so while it's a very big absolute number, in context it's a relatively small amount. So these results from phase 2 then again got pulled over into the next phase, which was looking at global trade impacts. So if we have that increase in demand, in the different scenarios that we modeled, what does that do to the availability, price, and providers' willingness to supply different wood products around the globe? And so, I have this picture up here. This is really only a portion of the forum model, which some very intelligent collaborators that we had at the U.S. Forest Service and the Bank of Canada were helpful enough to help us run, just as a sort of a way to understand how complicated the world wood products market is and how many different products this can account for. This is about a quarter of the different elements that are pulled into that forum. So this is estimating changes in wood products that are harvested, that are traded, that are sold based on demand drivers, based on those inputs of how many buildings we think are going to be made with mass timber in 2030, 2040, 2050. So it's using all of these social and economic and environmental predictors. How does regional population grow? How does that impact, housing starts and demand for, non-housing wood products in different places? And then how does that impact the overall economy of both regions and individual countries? And to try and sum up the results of this is succinctly as we can. When there's an increase in mass timber, we see a subsequent increase in wood volume consumed, and vice versa. When there's a decrease, we see a decrease in wood volume consumed. To look at some of those in detail, again, the absolute numbers here in terms of millions of cubic meters are very big numbers, but they're relatively small in context. So global increase in demand for, this is coniferous harvest volume that we're thinking about now, because it's coniferous species that are used to make mass timber. Global increase is predicted by I believe it was the medium demand scenario to be about 2%, right? So it's a pretty big number when you think about trees being harvested, but in terms of the demand for other more traditional products like 2x4s, that's a drop in the bucket. And again, that's going to vary depending on the region that you're working in. So even though there were lower adoption rates in China and some of the other Asian countries that we modeled, we found that there was a greater increase in coniferous harvest volume because of the overall amount of demand in that region, and also the focus between hardwood and softwood species being harvested in that region. So that brings us to the end of these first 3 published phases. This brings us up to date, and we're now into phase 4, which is really the thing close to my heart. As both a numbers nerd and a forester, we're now on to the what does this do in the woods in terms of trees being harvested and put on the landing, and that's the stuff I'm really excited about. So phase 4 is trying to connect those regional demand changes and how global trade is going to react to the increase in mass timber usage to stand level changes, right? When a forester is standing in the woods with a paint gun, how many more trees do they end up cutting because there's a higher market availability for softwood trees? And so we're trying to incorporate the production parameters for the types of trees that are used in creating mass timber, some of the logistical constraints in terms of existing mass timber infrastructure, where are there mills that are buying for these sorts of things, but also some of the physical constraints of the wood and physical properties that need to be incorporated in the elements of mass timber. And then also biological variables. So the things that that the foresters in the woods are actually thinking about when they're harvesting trees, when they're planning harvests of a given type. So the exact model that we're using, as I said earlier, is in development. We know that we're looking at, again, a series of scenarios where we're not trying to just pick the most likely one, but model a potential range of outcomes. And our strategy here is by and large to move from relatively simple models to more complex models over time as we get a better idea of how these things are going to play out at a stand level, and as we're able to talk to more and more experts in this field and get their input into our research. All right, so this is very busy slide, but I think it goes a long way to explaining sort of the steps that are involved here, right? So what we're trying to pull together in phase 4 is a bit complicated. We're trying to use timber inventory data from the FIA program to evaluate business as usual harvesting scenarios. What are people in the woods doing right now? Then we're trying to look at the impact of mass timber, the increased demand for softwood, roundwood that creates, and so what sort of tweaks might happen in the harvesting scenarios of tomorrow. We're also then trying to incorporate some elements of future climate and how that might impact the growth and yield of certain trees, as well as natural disturbance cycles. So, we know that we're looking at a very dynamic world over the coming decades. The impacts of climate change are already starting to be felt, but we expect for that to ramp up over the course of this century. So we're trying to incorporate that as we move forward in the modeling process, and come out with some sort of a prediction of the on-the-ground carbon impact, depending on how the demand for mass timber is met. And so what we want to produce is a suite of options that can be useful when policymakers and foresters and everybody in between, the people who are actually going to decide on the ground how mass timber demand is met, we want to give them the tools that help them make an informed decision, because we know that all of these decisions come with trade-offs. So we want them to be able to use the information that we can provide to make the best decision possible. All right, so sure everybody here is familiar with the carbon cycle generally, but again, I just kind of wanted to point out how many different portions of the carbon cycle we're trying to account for in this model, and the difficulty associated with that, right? So there's live and dead carbon in the trees, right? And so it's relatively simple. You can use the forest vegetation simulators, a growth and yield model developed by the Forest Service. It grows trees, it lets some of them die over time. That's relatively simple, right? But then you have the soil impacts of variations in mortality and how soil carbon changes over time. You've got the different species mixes and the amount of dead trees and how that impacts the likelihood of insect infestation. Then with the advent or not of insect infestation, you've got wildfire risk, right? So every of these additional elements that we add in, it becomes more difficult to pin things down to a specific answer. So I say that not just to garner your sympathy for what a hard thing that we're doing, but to say that as we get closer and closer to the end of this 5-phase project, we're likely to see sort of a ballooning in the uncertainty of some of these relationships. So, what's going to be the impact of mass timber demand on forests in 2030? We probably will be able to have a pretty good idea of that. But what's going to be the impact in 2080, given the uncertainty of insects and fire and soil carbon, is a lot less certain. Okay, so when we're trying to think for this analysis, we wanted to work within the US because we wanted the availability of data that we have in the US relative to some other regions of the globe. And then we started looking around the US for what is going to be sort of a sub-region that we can look at that gives us the ideal scenario, again, for starting simple and eventually moving to the more complex regions. We decided to go after the Pacific Northwest region of the country first. Two main reasons. One, you can see the little black symbols there represent mass timber facilities in the United States. And there's a lot of mass timber facilities already in operation in the Pacific Northwest. So we know that there's going to be, or that the increase in demand that we predict is most likely to occur in those portions of the country. Secondly, this map is showing the distribution of hardwood and softwood forests across the United States. And you see the Pacific Northwest is dominated by softwood species. So it is exclusively softwood species, at least at present, that are used for making mass timber. So we chose to tunnel in on the Pacific Northwest. A couple other reasons that it sort of makes an ideal scenario is that there's been, very good, or I shouldn't say good, there's been very high levels of adoption in the building trades and architecture housing starts and things like that in the Pacific Northwest. So not only are they a supplier of mass timber, but they are also a consumer of mass timber. And then, this map on the left-hand side, this is showing the U.S. Forest Service ecological regions for the Pacific Northwest. And relative to some other portions of the country, these ecological regions can be broken up into relatively simplistic regions that let us sort of tunnel in on, what's the difference in management between ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, right? So it's not to say that any forest is truly simple, but when you think about the mixed species forests of the Southern Appalachians, certainly a Douglas fir forest looks simple next to that. All right, so what are we actually doing for this phase? So the first step is to identify the variables that correlate with current harvesting practice. So you'll see this acronym BAU, that's just business as usual. You'll see that a bunch. So we want to know, like right now, people are out there marking trees, there's loggers cutting trees, there's mills offering differential prices for different species and grade types. And we want to understand within these regions, what's driving the decision to harvest one tree and not another? What's driving the decision to harvest one property and not another? Or even beyond that, how heavy to cut an individual property, right? We want to be able to understand that so that we can then implement the increased harvest of coniferous roundwood in a way that makes sense based on current patterns. So, we're using a couple of different dependent variables, the occurrence of a harvest and the intensity. And then we have, this is just a sampling of the independent variables. So we have, something like elevation where, hey, you might be more inclined to harvest a tree at 3,000 feet elevation than at 8,000 feet elevation, just because it's easier to get there, right? But we're trying out a whole bunch of different biophysical and socioeconomic variables. Once we can find a reasonable set of variables that help us describe the business as usual harvesting practice, we are going to be creating frames within which we can assess that harvesting practice as it is now. So we're looking for mutually exclusive areas like above or below 3,000 feet elevation, or Washington versus Oregon. We're trying to find those distinct areas that we can say, you know what, harvesting is a little bit different in this portion of the Pacific Northwest compared to this portion of the Pacific Northwest. The idea there is just being as precise as we can when we're thinking about business as usual harvesting and how increased demand might be met. So within each of those frames, then we're assessing the business as usual harvesting practice by species groups. So there's certain species that are currently make up the bulk of mass timber production. There's some other species that could be used but aren't necessarily common mass timber species. And then there's a whole bunch of species that aren't used for mass timber at all. So we're using those species groups and then some broad diameter classes, poles versus small saw timber versus large saw timber. Okay, so once we have those business as usual harvesting scenarios, we're going to be using the Forest Vegetation Simulator, FVS, to model forward several different scenarios. One is that business as usual case. One is the increased demand to meet mass timber demand. And one is going to be a no harvest scenario to basically maximize carbon storage. And there may be other scenarios in there, we're not entirely sure, but we use FVS to take all of those scenarios and model forward, over the next 50 years, what do we think the carbon impact is going to be? And then, put simply, step 4 is just comparing those results over time, over space. Where do we see carbon benefit or carbon cost associated with particular harvesting operations or changes in harvesting operations? So just to give folks an idea here, we've got, some deep research into the mass timber industry that Young has led, as well as some work done on the harvest pattern models, and that's been over the last 6 months. And moving forward, we're creating those harvest scenarios, we're simulating through FVS, and then we're incorporating the different disturbance and climate scenarios into those FVS runs that I mentioned earlier. And just to wrap up, one final slide for me, the expected outcomes that we see here, obviously we don't have final results at the moment, but what we expect is where there's increased harvesting in a concentrated way, where we see increases in clear cutting to meet that demand, there's going to be concentrated impacts, right? Obviously, anytime you cut a large number of trees in a small area, it's going to be a big change in the carbon dynamics of that particular stand. But where we see partial harvesting techniques dominating, and we're likely to see only moderate increases in the harvesting rate in a stand, we think there's going to be moderate impacts of or on the final carbon outcomes in those locations. Some of the other things that we're hoping to be able to investigate here also include, what if we could relax some of the requirements around mass timber? Right now, there's pretty strict requirements in terms of the species mix and the size and quality of individual trees. And so we want to spend some time digging into, hey, how feasible is it to imagine, using a crooked 4-inch Douglas fir to create mass timber, right? Like right now, that's the pie in the sky dream. What if we could do that? Would that change the carbon outcomes? So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Rachel to wrap us up and provide some closing thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. Really appreciate that. Yeah, just to say, so the last phase, which we hope to kick off later this year, is basically to communicate the results of phase 4 and work on integrating what we've learned in phase 4 back into phase 1. That'll likely be kind of a longer project that goes on into next year as well. As Ethan was talking about in the first instance, whole building LCAs still don't integrate sequestration benefit that you get from those trees. So how we put that back into whole building LCAs when you're looking at mass timber is something that we want to see about integrating back in. And so the other thing just to say is that this is a broader, this is part of a broader body of work. So we have other ongoing projects as well that are looking at how to essentially accelerate natural climate solutions through sustainable and responsible forest product markets while ensuring safeguards are met. So we're actually working quite closely with Michigan State FCCP team, including Kylie, to think about what kind of safeguards are needed as we look to unlock climate smart forest products. So just to mention that this is part of a broader body of work. And I think that's our last slide. Is that right, Ethan? Great, thanks. And I think we have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. So Kylie, should we hand it back over to you?
All right, thanks very much, guys, for a really interesting presentation, and one that you remarkably put a lot of information into, not a lot of time. So by that I mean, 45 minutes of time. So well done. So now we'll start the Q&A portion here. So to start, I've kind of binned some questions. The first, some clarifications regarding some of the slides that we have. So so mass timber adoption, what kind of market share are we talking about? So you talked about, absolute increases in how much more timber and so forth, but regarding, let's say, the optimistic scenario, what % of new construction is going to be mass timber? Do you have an idea about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I would point to some of the publications that are in that special issue for the exact numbers, because so the person who led that phase of the research was Indraneel Gangley, who's at the University of Washington. And to try and remember off the top of my head, so if we think about the regions of the world most likely to adopt new technologies, by and large, that's mainland Europe. And they're also one of the regions that's furthest ahead in terms of mass timber at this point. So they had the opportunity to grow the quickest. And then if we think about the medium or high adoption scenario, I think we were looking at something in the, Rachel, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was something like 40 or high 40% of buildings by 2060, 2080, right? So not next year, but within a reasonable time frame, seeing a very large percentage of buildings in mass timber. In most other model runs, you think about, most places in the US, most places in China or South America, we saw, even out into 2080, something more on the order of, 8, 10, 15%, a much more modest adoption rate.
Thank you. Wow, that is very high, isn't it? For that, yeah. And so related to that, for the optimistic scenario, do the exposure and adoption trends for new tech that you're looking at take into consideration policy incentives? So if the US or any other country is going to incentivize, heavily subsidized mass timber, is that built into that already? Is like the max we could expect reasonable for a country to do? Yeah.
Rachel, were you going to start?
Yeah, I was going to say it is. Again, I would refer to the reports, the individual studies around phase 2 that Indro wrote. He put several variables into all 3 scenarios. So what we're currently doing, the middle kind of, middle of the road, what's likely to happen in terms of mass timber adoption, and then the extreme or very optimistic scenario. He incorporated into all of those various things like diffusion rates, policy incentives, and potential changes. How countries are going to potentially meet their NDCs and what kind of subsidies might be needed among all 3 scenarios. So if you refer to the paper, you can see all of the various variables that he's put in there and accounted for across the 3 scenarios. Sorry, Ethan, was there anything else to add on that?
The only other thing I was going to mention is in terms of that technology adoption, what I remember Indro describing was you can look back and with any technology, you see basically a rotated sigmoid curve of adoption, right? You've got a few people that are in that early adoption curve. You've got the majority of a population adopting a given technology, and then you've got those stragglers who don't want to adopt the technology until everyone else is on board, right? And that basically the shape of that curve changes depending on the social dynamics within a given region and the reliability of a given technology. So the way that he informed that was by looking at past building trade technological adoption in those various locations. And so part of that is going to be just, that, I don't know, the Swedes are more willing than the Americans to try a new building technique. But part of it is also going to be if the Swedish government consistently institutes policy that rewards new building techniques or carbon smart building techniques. So there's sort of an implicit element there as well.
Okay, wow, that is a lot of different dynamics, indeed. Okay, so here are a couple questions on related to some, we were talking about partial versus concentrated harvesting dynamics and how far the range of impact, let's say, might be. So given transportation costs and so forth, what is a reasonable distance from which you might expect mass timber materials to be sourced? Would it be reasonable at all to fear that increased wood demand in the US could lead to imports from Brazil, for instance? Or is illegal logging globally a concern if we're talking about US mass timber, or is that so far that it wouldn't realistically be brought into mass timber production in the US?
Yeah, so Yang, jump in if you have specific information on that radius of demand for mass timber industry. But generally speaking, I mean, mass timber is a high value, value added product, but it's still a large, heavy, dense product where, moving the raw materials long distances doesn't usually make economic sense. And, where this is a structural component as opposed to a finish component, we move black walnut all over the world because it's a showpiece, right? But you don't tend to move spruce and fir 5,000 miles because it's spruce and fir, right? You can get a 2x4 anywhere. So if let's say all the mass timber demand is met in the US through the Pacific Northwest, the most likely location that we're going to be importing wood is Canada, right? Is probably BC and that region of Canada. If we're talking about the Southeast and increases in plants in the southeastern United States, if we see a spike in mass timber production there, the most likely outcome to meet that is actually going to be increased establishment of plantations based on the rotation length that we have in the Southeast, right? And so it might displace other products. That would be something that we'd like to go back and, at the end of this, be able to, if you'll excuse the pun, recycle our results back into the earlier phases. We'd like to be able to see how that's going to impact the market, and whether some of those displaced other products might, shift demand for other trees being harvested. But we certainly wouldn't expect that, an increase in softwood in Washington State is going to be, importing wood for that purpose from Brazil.
And
Can I just add to that? Sorry.
Mhm.
And Young, you looks like you might have something else to add. So first, I see Hong Mei is on this call. Hi, Hong Mei. She was really instrumental in helping us put together the first phase LCAs. So Hong Mei, I don't know if there's anything to add from your perspective about that question, but just two things to quickly add. The first is that the majority of mass timber right now comes from softwood, not tropical hardwood, as Ethan was saying. So it really, to date, has not been a concern that mass timber demand is going to come from a tree source that has historically not been used at all. Secondly, in some of the LCAs, we have already considered transportation costs. So we didn't show all of the examples, but we did look at 6 LCAs globally. And in our LCA in Santiago, Chile, for example, we found that the wood, that the total global warming potential did decrease because you're having to really bring those logs in from further away. So those are some of the things that we kind of have already been considering from the carbon standpoint. But Young, was there anything else to add there?
Yeah, I just want to mention that the mass timber, such as CLT, can use a broad category of local native species for production. So our softwood species, tree gravity greater than 0.35 can be used for produce mass timber. So we're not going to import a large portion of timber resources from other countries to produce mass timber. So we are going to use native species. Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys all. That was very helpful conversation. Another question here is, so if we could relax mass timber parameters to allow for the use of different qualities of wood, is there a worry that we would be removing a source of biomass for other uses, such as sustainable wood aviation fuel, green hydrogen, and other products?
Yeah, I saw that come in the Q&A box, and Haley, good on you for being optimistic. I love the question, right? So I don't know. From my perspective, it would be an ideal world if there was so much demand for mass timber that it started competing with the burgeoning growing industry of biomass-based aviation fuel, right? Like, unfortunately, in 2022, I almost said 2021. It is 2022. The demand isn't high enough where those things are competing in a meaningful way, where you have, you know, only enough biomass for one and not the other. So I don't know thing one about sustainable aviation fuel or green hydrogen, but I know a little bit about low value products like Trex decking and biomass electricity. And by and large, those things are made from residual products, either the canopy of a tree being chipped or residues from sawmills being, you know, combined with polymers and glues and stuff into pressed form. So, and I believe that some of those same products are used for lignin extraction for molding, you know, car bumpers and things like that, at least in a experimental fashion. So visit any timber harvest the world around, and you will find plenty of biomass in the forms of, you know, the tops of trees, discarded portions of the main stem. I don't think that a lack of biomass is going to be what gets us here. I would take a yes and approach. Let's do mass timber and the sustainable aviation fuel.
Great. So we're about to run out of time here. So just one big last question, which is there anything you didn't include in this analysis that you would have liked to? You know, constraints of time, resources, whatever it may be. If you were funded again, or, you know, received another pool of funding, what's the next question that's missing here?
I've got my thoughts, but I'll let you two jump in.
Go ahead, Yang.
Ethan, go first.
So I'm going to say more time spent on the what if. The what if we could change the parameters of mass timber and incorporating that, you know, further back into the model, right? So that, you know, not only in phase 4 in the harvesting impacts, but also in the global trade model, what if we could use stems down to 6 inches or down to 4 inches in diameter? Because I think that there's a really significant incentive there for people in the mass timber industry, and it's just a matter of time until they start to decrease those size requirements, and who knows, maybe that's the best path forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I do see some limitations of our work. For example, we only consider like the impact of mass timber harvest on forest carbon like changes and forest structure change and composition change, but we do not consider other ecosystem services changes associated with mass timber harvesting. So if we have time and enough funding, we may extend our project in the future. Thank you.
Any add-ons, Rachel? Or
Yeah. The last thing I would just say is, in addition to Yang, is I would take all of that and also see how we can at least try to build out this forest impacts model across all of the case study regions that we originally started out with in phase 1. So we just have funding to do the forest impact model in the US at the moment, but we do have 3 other global LCAs that we've developed that we'd like to apply this to as well.
Well, if there anybody on the call with a lot of money they want to throw around. All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation. Going 2 minutes over here. Really appreciate your time and the work you put into this, and the whole, the presentation is just the tiny bit of the work, obviously. Thank you for the whole project that you're developing here. It's very cool stuff. And everybody else, thank you very much for joining us today, for listening in, for your questions, and as noted, the recording and supplementary materials, if we have them, will be up on the website, and you'll receive notice about that. So till next time, bid you all adieu. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for being here.
Thanks all.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.